And now for this last lecture of our conference, of our first day of the conference, I have the pleasure to welcome Lorenzo Piccoli. Lorenzo leads the work of the Migration Policy Center at the European University Institute in Firenze. And he's mainly interested in comparative politics, citizenship, human mobility, and more specifically in issues of inequalities around migration governance. Lorenzo is well known in Neuchâtel, and especially at the NCCR on the Move.
But also outside the university.
Yeah. Of course. He's been working as a scientific officer here for about 4 years.
4 years.
Yeah, 4 years. And actually, when I started working at the NCCR on the Move, I was his right hand or left hand man. I don't know exactly how we call that, but I was hired as a deputy scientific officer and to support him in all his important activities at the NCCR on the Move. And he was also in charge in 2019, I think, of the organization of the graduate conference, which was extremely successful. So I have to walk on his path, and it's quite difficult, I have to say. But when he was working at the NCCR, he launched many different initiatives to develop the collaborative research at the NCCR, and also to increase its visibility. And for example, he developed this quite impressive data set to track mobility restrictions during the COVID-19 pandemic. And he created this data set with a lot of people from the NCCR on the Move. Now it's called, this data set is called Citizenship, Migration and Mobility in a Pandemic. And it is still available on the website of the NCCR on the Move, but also on the Global SIT. It was a collaboration with the Global SIT Institute at the EUI. And I think he has become also a great expert in this field of research. But among the many initiatives that he launched at the NCCR, he also started to establish a directory of migration research institutions, which will form the basis of his talk today, because he will use this data to show where migration knowledge is produced and also what kinds of knowledge is produced and what implications it has on the field of migration and mobility studies. So I very much look forward to listening to him. He will be talking for about 20 minutes, yeah, more or less, and then we will have a round of discussion, but this session will be a bit shorter than the public lecture we had with Matthias Czajka, because afterwards, there's this guided tour and the program is still dense. So thank you very much, Lorenzo, and I look forward to listening to you.
Thank you, thanks. Thanks a lot. It will be a lot shorter because I'm aware I'm the last obstacle standing between you and freedom, the lake or the tour. And obviously, this is a case of nepotism. I'm here just because I was the scientific officer of the NCCR on the Move before. And I really wanted to get feedback on this project that we have been working on together with some colleagues over the last few years. Because when I was organizing the Neuchâtel Graduate Conference, I actually love talking with people. And I think you bring so much diversity and different approaches to the discussion that would have been extremely valuable to include in this piece of work. So if you think you are here for a public lecture, you've been misled. This is not going to be a lecture or a talk. I'm going to present some data, but the purpose of this session is really to have a debate. And actually, I hope you will be doing most of the speaking because many of you know more about this topic than I do. This is a side project. I take all the blame for it, but 2 other persons have really helped to push it across the finish line. One of them is maybe not in the room, but somewhere else in this building, Didier Rodin, Many of you have met him. And you can talk to him also tomorrow. And the other person is Andrew Geddes, with whom I currently work at the Migration Policy Center that is part of the European University Institute in Florence. Before I start, I did an activity last week, and some of the participants told me, okay, this is the last session of the day. We are exhausted. Can we do a little energizing exercise before we start? And then they put on a song of Shakira, and we had to dance. I'm not going to do it now, but I would like to ask those of you who are sitting in the back, if you can please come up front, because I hate this setting, but it would be really nice to have a debate. And as you please move up to the front, at least some of you, thanks to the brave ones who are, please remember to interrupt me at any moment. Again, I don't want this to be a lecture. I want you to shoot me down and bring your voice to the table.
Make some noise.
Yeah, make some noise. Okay, amazing. First row. Okay, great. A bit nicer this way, even though it's still bad in this setting. Okay, so this collection of information on different research institutes was born out of a booming field of literature on migration studies. And people have been talking about the coming of age of the discipline of migration studies. Now, the coming of age is manifested in different ways. And we are actually shaping this coming of age at this very moment. The conference that we are at is part of it. Or you can think of the IMISCO conference, and many of you were there last week. How many of you were there? Hands up. Wow, a lot of people. Another conference coming up next month. Have you heard about it? Massive conference on migration. Anyone? Doris?
I've heard about it, yeah.
You have? How is it called?
I'm not going. I can't remember. It's going, yes.
So the migration conference taking place in Hamburg, mainly organized by economists. So maybe that's why you don't know it. I'm not an economist myself, and I feel few people in the room are economists. But that's also massive. Hundreds of people will be there at the end of August. You can think of the booming number of scientific journals dedicated to migration and mobility. Do you know how many academic journals there are dedicated specifically to this topic now? Think about it. The answer is 11, which for a scientific topic is really a lot. And 5 of those journals were created over the last 20 years. So fairly recently, I think I highlighted them in bold, the most new ones. And finally, the number of study programs. So Matthias Chaika, who was here this morning, I think he's the head of a doctoral program on migration studies. Here at the NCCR on the Move, you have the doctoral program in migration and mobility studies. And I'm ready to bet many of you are part of a program that is specifically focused on either migration or human mobility or refugee studies. I myself, for example, organize an event that is called the Migration Summer School. So you think of those different activities has contributed to the institutionalization of migration study as a discipline in itself. And of course, this is important because as for every process of institutionalization, you also have the creation of some boundaries. And so scholars have been talking, for example, of the expanding boundaries, maybe in terms of the volume of activities and the volume of publications, but also problematizing a bit this growth over time, showing that there is a lot of self-referentiality. We talk a lot among each other. Now, maybe for some of you, this is the first time you go to a conference. For many, it's probably not the first time, and you start seeing the same people over and over again. And then some people, for example, Janinda Hinden here at the University of Neuchâtel, shows that this could also be problematic because then we take some categories for granted. We really institutionalize some categories and we focus our attention on those. So that's where we wanted to start with this data collection. A data collection, as Robin mentioned, of information on the centers that are dedicated specifically to conduct research on migration and or human mobility. And we wanted to do this to answer two questions that are still a little bit open. And the first question is, so what are the key dimensions of this institutionalization? Where does it take place and how does it take place? And then, of course, what are the implications of these? And I was very happy this morning at the end of the keynote, that was actually a lecture with Matthias Czajka, to hear many questions on what you refer to as the politics of knowledge production in the field, our role in these. And my friends always make fun of me saying I'm too much of an existentialist, always questioning what am I doing here, why am I alive? But that's what we would like to do with this session collectively. So it's going to be a bit of a group therapy, thinking about our role within this process of institutionalization of migration studies. Because if you are here, you are part of that. So I'm going to keep it very short, and please, then I want to hear from you, your ideas, your suggestions. Why does this matter? I think it matters because there are two different elements of this process. The first one is the activities that we can observe, the centers, what we refer to in the paper that we have published together with DDA and with NGO. We refer to it as the infrastructural element. So, of course, all the resources, all the things that we can see. But then there is also a semantic element that comes with this process. And the semantic element is about the terminology that we use. Again, the objects of observation, the priorities that we decide to focus on in our work. And we think that dedicated institutes that focus on migration and mobility are particularly important for those two elements. For the first element, because they act a bit like gatekeepers. Again, many of us have either been trained or are currently working in those centers that are specifically dedicated to migration and mobility. And in terms of the terminology, again, those centers are the drivers behind the consolidation of some ideas, of some concepts in the discipline. Obviously, there is a lot of research on migration and mobility, and very good research, that is also produced outside of those specialized centers, right? But we still think it is important to have a clear idea of where those centers are and what they do. So what those centers look like, a bit like this. This is just a random selection I've made yesterday evening at the hotel while I was falling asleep. So I could not include all the institutes that we found. And spoiler, in total, well, try to think how many institutes you think exist globally dedicated to migration and mobility. I'm going to give you the number in a second. But those are only a few. Some of them are based in Switzerland. Some others are based in, well, all different regions of the world. And I imagine some of you are working for those institutes. I am. The Migration Policy Center is there. But I'm sure you know people who are working there, at least. Right, so we collected all information we could, and we tried to be as systematic as possible in identifying research institutes dedicated to this topic. This is how we define them. And as of now, in the database, we have 282 institutes that have been created starting from 1945 until today. Only 3 of those institutes have closed down their operations. All the other, that means 279, are still active. And recently we observed that on average about 10 new institutes dedicated to migration and mobility specifically are being created every single year. So that's really a lot if you think about it. Those are some of the variables that we include in the repository. The repository is available online. You can download it. I will be happy to send you the link. But thanks to Andreas Wimmer, I'm already forgetting, Andreas Perret. Andreas is not here. Sorry, Andreas, wherever you are. Thanks to Andreas Perret, we created an interactive visualization that's really cool. Thanks to Andreas. So I invite you to check out the interactive visualization. Check if there are institutes that you think should be there, and if they're not, let me or us know, and we want to expand it over time. Those are some of the things we measure. Again, if you have ideas on other things we could measure, let us know, okay? So this is what we have been doing for the last 3 years. It was just a side project for all of us. You know a lot more about this topic than I do, but I wanted to try and present some of the things we found. First, timeline, how this evolved over time. This is a very simple figure. 2 quick observations from this figure. Number one, there has been a quick acceleration in the number of institutes existing globally, especially in the 90s, and then again in the 2010s. So that's what we see, especially in Europe, but not only. We'll talk a bit more about the geographical concentration in a second. Why? We do not know for sure, but we think that's because of conferences. Conferences have been a very powerful factor behind the institutionalization, the creation of new centers, and especially in the case of Europe, North America and South America, the creation of dedicated funding programs and projects that were launched by governments, or in the case of Europe, by the European Commission. Again, IMISCOE, gigantic program that led to the creation of a lot of centers dedicated specifically to migration and mobility. Why does IMISCOE exist? In the first place, because of government funding. There was a huge boost in investing on research on migration and specific topics on migration in Europe that led to the creation of IMISCOE. Okay, that was only for the timeline. I'm very much interruptible, so please jump in if there is anything you want to say at this stage. More interestingly, I think this is a map. It's not interactive in here, but it's interactive online of where the institutes are as of actually 2020. We stopped the data collection in 2020, but later this year we want to update it and include new institutes. Actually, I know already that a couple of you are working in institutes that were created after 2020. Okay, so you look at this map, and there is maybe one thing, maybe more, that is really striking. What is it?
The concentration.
Yes, Doris, thanks. Where are all the institutes?
Europe.
A lot of institutes in Europe. I would say also many institutes in the Americas, in specific parts of the Americas, in California, and then on the East Coast, and then in Brazil. Brazil, why? I don't know, do we have anyone from Brazil in here? Yes. Why Brazil? Sorry, I didn't want to put the spotlight.
Maybe because of what's called the crisis, shifts in the race profile of the migrant century, really shifting the white migrants from Europe to the Latin Americas. Public policies for different affecting the.
Yes, and I think that's a very encouraging answer. I may be wrong, but I think there is a proxy effect that is because of new issues that were perceived as challenging in the field. The government, again, invested a lot of money in the creation of dedicated centers to study migration. And I think over 12 different centers were open thanks to government funding specifically. So again, we see that government funding is extremely important. And I would like to problematize that in a second, right? So Europe and the Americas mainly. Other regions of the world, very few. Maybe, and I'm hoping again, people in the room will suggest more institutes that we were not able to find. For example, in Russia, in China, very few institutes. Maybe some of them have fallen out of our radar. But the point is that there doesn't seem to be an immediate connection between the number of people who move and the interest in the topic. There are a lot of countries where you have a lot of immigrants, actually a lot of immigrants also, and very few research centers that are in there. Yes?
I'm sorry, it's very difficult to see. Maybe I'm sitting in a bad place. But find how you actually define these, are they only institutes? For example, it's shocking to me coming from America that it's a high concentration. I'm living in New York. We have very few migration centers. We have some phenomenal names called conference ad hoc on migration, but they're not operational. And that's the joke about the concentration being immigration in country. California, I just spent a few months in very prominent, one of the most, maybe you know, the Center for Migration Studies, Comparative Studies, we all hear of it. There's no institutional funding there. It's just a name, a center where people come and go. And so it's true that there is sort of this familiar. How do you define the way that you are?
So we define them as research center that focus on either migration or mobility, either because this appears in the name or in the description that they have. And of course, they change a lot. So some of them are very active. I would imagine in the US, there are a lot. Probably some of them are like empty boxes. And some are really active. I know, for example, the Migration Policy Institute, because we get confused with them a lot. The Migration Policy Lab at Stanford, or I think it's in New York also the Scalabrini Center on Migration. And I'm mentioning the Scalabrini Center because I think many of us, when we think of those centers, we think of academic institutions. We also include think tanks or centers where you conduct research, but maybe they're not academic, and we actually distinguish it in the database and the interactive visualization. And we also include museums. Some museums, they also do research. We have very few at the moment because it was not our priority, to be honest. I think there are a lot more museums that we could include. I know that there is a museum in Finland that is extremely active in doing research on migration, mainly emigration abroad. But for sure, those institutes are very different. I think in the first round, we actually included one place that was recently quoted on an article by the New Yorker, which is called, Galia, I'm sure you know, the Center for Immigration Research, that is also in the US, very active, extremely problematic because they are extremely conservative. So those, we decided in the end, after engaging in some discussions, not to include them in the database if their credibility was contested. But I'm sure there are a lot of places that exist on paper, but maybe they do very little or nothing. Okay, thanks a lot. So that's something to keep in mind. And actually, another thing we try to capture, but we do very badly, is the number of people who work in those different places, because some are huge, again, the Migration Policy Institute, and some are very tiny. Maybe you have 3 or 4 people who work there. Okay, so what drives research? Well, it's going to be unsurprising for, I think, almost all of you. Yes, the volume of migration in a way, but especially money. So we do find a strong correlation between high GDP per capita and the presence of a high number of research institutes. You can see it up there. Credit for this figure to DDA and for all the elaboration. You can ask me questions. I probably won't be able to answer them. But if you look at these, you see there is a strong correlation between, again, high GDP per capita and having more research institutes in the country. Initially, our hypothesis was that having a high number of migrants would lead to a high number of research institutes. That's not the case. Having a high number of immigrants is conducive to a high number of institutes. Having a high number of emigrants is not. So you see already some biases that, again, are not surprising. Most of us have been thinking about this for a long time, I guess, but we hope it's useful to have, as Matthias would have said this morning, a measurement of those biases. Okay, so those are the drivers. Happy to come back to this. I was hoping Didier would have been in the room so that he could take the blame for. But the simple argument that is based on this, again, unsurprising, is that the presence of research institutes dedicated to migration and mobility is driven mainly by having money and having immigrants. Okay, why is this problematic? We are moving from the infrastructural to the semantic dimension. Here I put together the text of all these 282 organizations as they present themselves in their mission statement, translated in English, and try to generate very simple word cloud to see what kind of terms come up most frequently. Have a look, try to think of whether this is in line with your focus of interest. For me, I would say it partially is, but of course I'm a white male based in Europe. I've been doing a lot of research on policy, on citizenship. Actually, I think citizenship is not there. I've been doing a lot of research on activism. Activism is also not there. What is there? Again, I'm curious to hear from you. My answer, the things I notice are the following. I've identified 4. Number 1, a lot more focus of attention on migration than on mobility. Migration appears 500 times. Mobility only appears 50 times. Also unsurprising. Second, immigration is there. Immigration is not. I think immigration is only used 10 or 15 times. Immigration is used about 60 times. Still less than I would have expected, but clearly a bias. Quite a bit of emphasis on, again, policy and politics, but not on other issue areas. And in terms of the substantive topics of research, there are 3 that come up most frequently: integration, development, and refugees. Of course, 3 topics that, again, I would argue are driven by concerns and preoccupations of high-income countries that are net recipients, if you want to use that term, of migration. And also topics that are likely to be driven, as we were talking about this morning, by funding programs that tell researchers, this is what you have to focus on, conduct research on this topic. Why is it problematic? Because, of course, and many people have argued this much better than I am now, this creates huge inequalities between people based in high-income countries and people who are based in low-income countries. And those inequalities, we can see them, for example, in the use of some exclusive categories, as you see in here, of the language that we use, that sometimes it's not inclusive or it's not reflexive. And also journal policies and bibliographies, it's a lot more difficult for people who are not based in high-income countries just to access journals, to read the articles. It's even more difficult to publish. And if you look at the references, those who get cited are scholars who are based in high-income countries with high numbers of immigrants. Our small contribution to this discussion is that it is crucial, of course, to reflect on those issues. But there is a problem at an even earlier stage, and the problem is a problem of money. If all the institutes are still based in high-income countries, of course we can use a more inclusive language, of course we can try to be very reflexive about the categories, of course we can try to change journal policies, but we won't go very far, okay? And that's why I hope you can step in and try to suggest some ideas of how to redress these inequality. Can I just finish 5 seconds? So then I shut up. Our conclusion for this is that, of course, we still are not part of a global network of scholars. It's a very unequal network of scholars globally. There are a few things that maybe could be done. So we suggest the creation of partnerships, working together on the organization of events, always trying to ensure that people who participate in events come from different regions of the world. And also, and some researchers at PRIO, I don't know, is anyone based at PRIO in here, in Oslo? No, are doing something that I would think it's a good practice. So when they develop a research program, they develop it together with people who are not in high-income countries, and they work together with them on those research programs. I would think those are some good practices. Of course, there is a lot more that should be done. And of course, again, this can only change if funding programs and their requirements also change, because otherwise the room for action will remain extremely limited. We think this is important not only for migration scholars, we are thinking as migration scholars here, but also for other scholars. Think about those working on climate change, global warming, gender, trade. I wouldn't be surprised if in those disciplines you see the same kind of inequalities. Okay, that's where I stop, and I really hope you will step in and give criticisms, but also ideas and suggestions on what we can do together. Thanks a lot.
I'm just wondering, because you are talking about this inequality of knowledge production between the global north and the global south. I'm also wondering whether it could be a result of like the colonial dynamics in knowledge production, and the fact that a number of scholars from the global south might frame their research on migration actually as like a regional studies. You know, for example, let's say a Vietnamese scholar would frame their research within the field of Southeast Asian studies instead of migration studies, because their agenda doesn't really match with the agenda of migration studies as spring from the global north. So I'm also wondering whether there's a number of research that goes outside of the radar just because they need to fit with the frame that's already existing. And, you know, there is this kind of regional research mostly in the global south because of the colonial dynamics, right? So yeah, I'm wondering about that. So I got a small comment on the...
Sorry, can I ask your names later? Unless I know, of course. And
on the criteria for selecting the journals, because I see there are no journals from, you know, that are not impact factor journals. Like for instance, I'm thinking about Latin American journals, Remo is the biggest one, Latin America, Revista Interdisciplinaria Movilidad Humana, is not there.
can I say criticisms to me like this, but the rest come because on the first question, you know a lot more than I do. So if we can leave them floating and also feel free to engage with each other.
Well, I was wondering about the incentive to do such an outreach to low-income countries. Like, I understand why it is necessary from my point of view for like trying to decolonize the migration studies a bit, but I'm not sure the incentive is very strong within migration studies. And like to me, there's like an economic question as well, a question of competition between the different institutes and so on, which makes me wonder if there's an actual will from this institute to actually offer that.
Firstly, thank you for your presentation. And I thought about two questions. The first one is related to your identify what is the migration. Because in migration, it's got two sections. The first one may be internal migration. For example, in China, we got a lot of internal migration. I think it's one fifth of the total population in China is migrants, internal migrants. But in EU, maybe they have more, or in the US, there are more is the international migration. So how do you define the migration study in your research? And the second question is related to your data. Because you mentioned you're using the institute to measure the migration, how the concentration on your migration study. So I was wondering whether you can measure the migration study using the paper they publish. Maybe it would be better. For example, if the paper published about 200 about related to migration in China, that means they got a very high institution about migration studies. And in this way, maybe you can got a very robust checks about the study. I think.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Your name?
Thank you, Frank. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Ernest, and my question or my comment, in fact, it's a comment, is with two things. One is with regards to the issue of publishing, and I think you're quite right. The politics of publications and publishing, quite it's another mammoth mountain for all of us to climb. And I think that would explain most of the issues that we find in terms of, especially young emerging academics from the global south, who you are told that this is the journal to publish in if you're in migration studies, and some of them don't even see the light of the day unless they have someone, for example, who's a senior colleague who could assist them in some of the research. It's quite very useful research, contextually based, etc., etc. This is the stuff that needs to get out there. So if we want to establish networks with global scholars in the global south, I think we need to actually get those young emerging scholars who are actually doing incredible work in the area. The other issue that I wanted to comment, and I do agree with you, money talks, and some money talks louder than others. Independent of the currency, one is speaking. Some universities, for example, in Canada, they have quite a number of research chairs that are driving migration studies globally, but also nationally. And so I don't know if you look at research chairs, and I know in South Africa, for example, they pretty much copied the Canadian model of having research chairs that drive migration studies. And so, and that could be another avenue. And I do agree with you that supported by government or whoever the entity is, could drive the research to greater heights. So maybe look at some of these research chairs in addition to the work you're doing with centers, because some chairs operate independently of centers. And quite a number of interdisciplinary work is happening, combining geography, planning, and city studies, and all of those areas that you wouldn't think that the migration topic will emerge out of them. Some even in philosophy and economics and all of that. So I think we're also driven by disciplinary boundaries that we need to dismantle, because some of us work everywhere, and we want to work everywhere because it's about humanity. And
thanks. Yes, maybe following up on that. Yeah, that's super interesting. It's a bit, I was wondering in what language even you did this word out, because, and also beyond that, what do we mean by migration? I mean, for example, in the Islamic word pilgrimage is like the first thing that comes to mind when we think about migration. So would you include institutes that have been working for centuries on pilgrimage? So I guess it's also the question of the scope of this research. Is it that you're interested in self-identifying institutes that self-identify as migration studies? That would already be super interesting, or is it more like global and expanding? Because as we know, everything has a genealogy, and even migration, in the way we understand it today, has a certain way. So yeah, because coming from, I did some research in Iran, and it's also a context where it's not so easy to talk about Afghan refugees in Iran. And there's other ways to talk about it through intellectual presence of Afghans, through education programs, through pilgrimage. So I think in this sense, like it's not a surprise that there's not many migration institutes, so to say, in Iran, but so many people who work on these issues calling it in a different way. Yeah. Thanks.
Wow, okay. 2 minutes and then you go to the lake or you go to the walking.
Lorenzo, this has been a brilliant kind of session. I just want to say that so much work is done in English, and that's a huge impediment in kind of people who are working. So say you're saying I'm from Pakistan. And I read a bunch of migration papers in Pakistan, published my background academics, we did PhDs, masters in Pakistan. The undergraduate papers, they're just in English. But when you talk to the academics, we're talking like brilliant, ideas, brilliant stuff. And now kind of my main activities these days is to kind of sit with them, work with them, help them improve their abstracts, help them improve their papers, submit them to journals. But then also, like have them do PhDs about it. But just sitting with them, restructuring the papers, just fixing the English, and it's done massively kind of well. And there's not only migration, but in Pakistan study with kind of like the people who I work with. So I would encourage that everyone doing research anywhere to really work with the local academics, or even people outside the academy, kind of start translating that work. And I also tell a lot of the people who I work with that, don't write in English, right? To write in Dutch, because translation is going to be much easier. Translating is not the hard part. Access is the hard part. You have access to all of these communities.
You write it in local language, you tell it to someone else, translate it to be really, really easy. And then you can kind of like go outside, because minimally then you can become citable. And that's going to start economizing the discipline, that's going to start economizing the discipline at large. And I mean, this really is a tragedy of academia, that, for example, if I want to study Pakhtun language in Karachi, my PhD should be at the University of Karachi. But instead, or I can stay 4 years over there, but instead I have to go abroad, in Europe or North America, do a PhD over there, spend a year pre-field work, then do field work for a year, then go back and write. So really that area is where I need to be. And that's really, really to shift the balance. So thank you so much for this presentation.
And you are?
Same.
Hi. Thank you so much. This is amazing work, and I think it's very important that we kind of understand where the research we do is coming from. I have 2 points. So I think as a starting point, this analysis is very interesting, but immediately what struck me was, okay, this is one, not descriptively where the institutes are, but kind of what goes into that before is, well, what is their impact? And how does their impact differ depending on where that institute is kind of situated, right? And also, what is the connectedness between those two? Because ultimately, that's what's of interest, right? You want to know who contributes to the field and how that relates to kind of geographical differences. So I was interested in whether you were considering to connect this with article databases, with kind of scholar databases, whether you were thinking about maybe looking at who gets admitted to conferences in the field and kind of what institutions are represented and what institutions are not. I know that there's this massive data set from Google Scholar, which also includes affiliations and likely also affiliations to institutes. A colleague of mine is working with that. So I think it would be super fascinating to look at kind of with network analysis, say how this plays out. Thank you.
Very brief to make it even more complex and not really offering a solution, I'm afraid, but to also place some serious question marks in existing partnerships between the global North and South, because I think the script is still not at all decolonized. So I think it's hard to do it well, and I think we should avoid that. It's reproducing again this kind of people working, doing the field work, doing the hard work, and then the knowledge ending up under the name of a scholar in the global North without actual recognition or resources going to the global South. And just adding that to complexify.
Well, I just wanted if you could say a little bit more. I think it was very interesting. It is a great study. But I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you think the impact, what does it say? So for me, for example, I wonder, as I'm thinking about this, whether the growth of these centers, institutes, whatever you call them, is an indication that migration scholars don't fit into that field, but out of the field. One reason I'm asking this is I see that with the growth of migration journals, and there is definitely a very wonderful options today that didn't exist many years ago. With that growth, what I realize is that many scholars within their own field, and we're not talking about necessarily interdisciplinary, are not finding their voice within the mainstream. So my concern, for example, is to look at, well, how many migration scholars are getting published into the mainstream journals? I mean, like that's what I'd like to know. How much impact are academics making on our issue, right, within the mainstream discipline? Are we just talking to an echo chamber of just different scholars that we, for example, today I'm in one center of migration, then I'm going to go to the other side of the world and I'll meet the same colleagues and we'll know each other? Or can we really emerge within our own field, sort of showing that migration is really whatever an issue within political science, sociology, or whatever? I know that our concern is interdisciplinary, but I think that we also, especially as young scholars here, it's really important for us to make a break within our training fields. So that's what I'd like to hear you say. What is the impact of these centers?
Thank you very much for your presentation, Rebecca. I think it was the Cantor who said in 2021 that all internally displaced people as all IDPs are future refugees. I was wondering if you find any connection between the refugee research to the forced migration perspective from the global southern perspective, if you find any connection, because I was also looking for similar literature and I didn't find anything. But in my own research, I found a connection between 2019 and today. I find that a lot of people that I was working with and illegally migrated to Europe who were IDPs. So do you find such a connection between refugee research and IDP research from the global south and the global perspective? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ritika. I just wanted to, it's just a comment. I just wanted to say that even this distinction between global south and global north, I'm just categorizing and putting it into a box. So this politics of knowledge also exists within the global south, and not all academics get a say within the global south as well. And I'm not sure which of these institutes were being looked at because I couldn't, of course, access the interactive map. So I just had a small suggestion about it as well. At least like I saw West Bengal, which is like the place that I come from in India. And it is also very top down in terms of academic access and everything. So I don't know if you are considering like more bottom-up researches conducted by NGOs or other small groups who are working with communities who are directly like, going through the lived experiences of them. Rather than looking at simply the research institutes which are existing even in the global south.
Thank you. I just would like to say all for this research from Lorenzo is a great attempt, but I want to raise 2 points. So the first point is in response to Nina and Mahiro, Rebecca, and Radhika's point on the Global South-North division. Besides the fact that Rebecca mentioned the Global Southern institution might not define itself as Global Southern, there is a fact that it's a matter of fact that a lot of scholars working on Global South are actually located in Global Northern institutions. So I'm wondering this might be a consideration. And my second point is in response to Yufeng and Said Hossain's point on the language, whether the language matters. And I happened to just read an article, a Chinese article listing how many migration institutions are in the Chinese-speaking realm. And so my question is, what if there is no equivalence of the word migration? You mentioned there are 16 institutions working in Chinese-speaking realm, and I tried to just now translate them into the nearest English word, and my translations are following. So the 16 institutions are basically called expatriates, diaspora, rural urban workers, floating population, out-migration, and immigration. So only one of them can be approximately translated in migration. And the second minor point about the language, I might be slightly different, disagree with Said that I think language really matters because the translation can be an important part. For example, the process of rural urban migrants getting into getting a rural household registration. I tried to find a word in English, but there is no word in English because it's called citizenization. However, in French language, it differentiates citoyen and citoyen, which actually give a good implication of the words in the equivalent Chinese language. So I'm reflecting on the fact that we are communicating in English in a French-speaking institution. But anyway, so maybe the final point is that intercultural and interlanguage collaboration are very important. So if there are any need to, like maybe the Chinese-speaking institution migration, I would be very humble to contribute. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for your very insightful presentation. I don't know if you did this, but I was just wondering if it was going to be interesting to also include NGOs. Because I know for sure that there's some NGOs that have a clear aim of advocating for migrant rights. But one way to do this is to produce research that are really context specific and really regional specific. And I was just wondering, what do you think about this within source? I mean, it's probably not stated clearly as part of your mission statement, but it's something they do, very often, very regularly. So what do you think about it?
I just have a very here. So I just want to ask you a question. First is from everyone, what is knowledge for you? And then why it is a West or white people responsibility or understood in a bigger discourse that the knowledge production is on the global north than on the global south? And the third question is that there are many scholars who are working in a global north, which belongs to global south. So how do you categorize that knowledge and those scholars?
Yeah.
Are there boundaries or not?
And your name again? Sorry, I didn't get it.
Fatia, Fatia.
Following up this question about boundary making, and at the risk of being maybe rather cynical, I'm thinking back to sorry, my name is Elise. I'm thinking back to the map that we saw and this concentration of institutes, I'll use that word very broadly speaking, in Europe, in DC, maybe California. And I'm wondering, forgive me for this existential question, or somewhat existential, but I also need to think about this in terms of myself. To what extent are these institutes concentrated in places where migration is viewed very much or constructed very much as a social problem to be solved, or as an unruly phenomenon that has to be addressed to maintain order? To what extent are we seeing, funding channeled into research and migration studies in our discipline that funds all of our research, that funds our supervisors' research, the projects that we're on? In my case, I've worked for many years on a project about return. So I have some sub-questions like, what is the European Research Council's interest in return of racialized migrants to Latin America, for instance? I guess my question is our field redeemable? So yeah, like I said, forgive me for this very dark question. And I'm thinking about this debate that's been unfolding, in case anyone's interested, and maybe many of you have already read it, but in ethnic and racial studies this year, I know Willem Schenkel published an article, to decolonize migration studies is to dismantle it. So I have no answer, and of course I'm very implicated in all the questions that I'm asking, but I thought I would post some links. Thank you.
Since I have my maybe it's a view of scholars, particularly in Africa, 80% scholars that are frustrated by publishing channels that we already have. For instance, what you just showed us, the number of journals that we have in migration, maybe also applicable to other fields as well. You find that some of the papers that we try to publish in these journals are rejected based on regional. They are called sometimes that they're just applicable to a region, of which we think that it should be published in the migration journals, right? So at the end of the day, because we are looking for journals that are actually having a better rating, we are going to publish in other journals that are not even migration journals. Yeah, I think that's my contribution is we should make it reform in terms of who constitutes the bodies of the journals that we already have, for which you find that maybe you go to one journal, there's an African, maybe university. The professor there is already maybe retired, we need to consistently review people who makes those journals. And it includes new leading scholars in our field, so that maybe when scholars or emerging scholars are submitting papers, they can also get some considerations. I don't know if we are all getting what I'm trying to question.
Hi, I'm Sarah from NCCR on the move. My question is, first question is, has there been similar studies in the context of migration studies being done like what you did, or this is the first of its kind? And secondly, maybe I missed it in your presentation, but have you looked at the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism database? It's a database which lists all of the most of the institutes, associations, and networks that work on international migration, including diaspora and transnationalism issues. Thanks.
What do I do?
The sentence to answer all these questions. So good luck.
Thanks. Also, I don't feel entitled to answer. My hope really coming here in front of you and when publishing this database and the article was to continue a conversation that other people have started. I have not. Try to do something that has not been done before, but to bring other people to the table. So you have my contact. You've given so many important ideas. Please write to me if you think there is something that you can do as part of this project. I'm always happy to work together collaboratively. Again, I don't feel entitled to answer many of your questions. What I can say is that some of the problems that you have identified, I think, are a reflection of the general evolution of the field. So, for example, the hegemony of English as the lingua franca and also the language that we use to select the journals in here, that's because that's what the institutionalization of migration studies is contributing to. If you are not speaking in English, you are considered to be outside of the boundaries of the discipline. Is that right? Is it wrong? I personally think it's wrong, but that's also one criteria that is consistently used to exclude. Yeah, I'm sorry, I could go on and on, but I think I can. Also, existentially, I'm struggling with an issue of, am I the right person to answer those questions? Please comment all to me. I'll be here tonight and tomorrow. And if we can do something together, I'd be delighted. Thanks to some of you.